after the AGM, which went extremely well, very smoothly, I'm delighted to say, and delighted to see you here this evening. Also to welcome those watching online or who will be. So it is my immense pleasure to welcome back Martin Brown, who has spoken before, and you, I'm sure, will not be disappointed. He's an excellent speaker. And his topic this evening, he'll be drawing on his recent book, The Bondian Cold War, The Transnational Legacy of a Cultural Icon. He will explore James Bond as a cultural figure of the Cold War, and the talk will examine how Bond's stories reflected and sometimes reshaped the politics, tensions, and popular culture of the era, and how the spy became a global, transnational icon across novels, films, comics, and video games. Martin Brown is Professor of International History at Richmond American University, London, a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, a member of Chatham House, and the New Diplomatic History Network. From 2018 to 2019, he was a lead researcher at the Center of Excellence in Intercultural Studies at the University of Tallinn. His research interests include Central European history, Czechoslovak-British relations, and Cold War culture. I do apologize for the croak. I haven't managed to get rid of it for this evening. But it is my immense pleasure now to ask Martin to present his talk. Thank you very much.
I don't know if people can hear me without the microphone, or do I need a microphone? Microphone would be preferable. That's fine. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm not sure quite how I'm going to compete with the excitement of a BCSA AGM. So I suspect this will be an immense disappointment coming directly after that. I should also say a couple of words about how I ended up talking about James Bond. I am by training a diplomatic historian, and my PhD, as Jana kindly pointed out, was about Anglo-Czechoslovak relations during the Second World War. And James Bond is not directly related to that. So one of the first things I want to do is try and give some small explanation of how I ended up talking about James Bond. And the other thing is I want to do is explain what this book is about. I should point out I'm not the sole author. It's a collected volume of articles that came out of a conference at the University of Tallinn back in 2018, 2019. Much to my surprise, as I was actually at Tallinn University researching détente in the 1970s and the Helsinki Final Act of August 1975, which I thought I would organize a conference on. And when I got to the funding committee and asked them whether they'd be interested in this, they looked terribly bored. And they said, do you have anything else up your sleeve? I said, well, I teach a university course on James Bond in international history. Would you be interested in that? And suddenly their eyes lit up and said, yes, we'll give you money for that. So this book comes out of the fact that there's an interest in James Bond in Estonia, of all places you might think. I happen to spend a fair amount of time in Estonia because my wife is Estonian and my kids are half British and half Estonian. That's why I was in Tallinn, for another reason. So I want to explain a little about how the book came to be, what's in the book, a little about James Bond. I've got 7 points, or 007 points if you prefer to go through. Yeah, a bit of a crude joke. To try and explain what we do know about Bond and what we don't know about Bond. I couldn't help noticing that tonight's title was The Spy We All Love, but I suspect there might be a few dissenters in the audience. I suspect not everyone loves James Bond, which is absolutely fine. I'm not here as a propagandist to say you must do. There might be some haters, and that's fine too. Nor am I here to argue that it's great cinema or great literature or great anything else. I am here to try and argue that it has a cultural significance way beyond what's on the page or what's on the screen. And I think that's what makes it interesting. And the transnational bit is interesting because I think although it's partly British, I mean, it's interesting how people think that Bond is peculiarly British, but he's not and never was. After all, Bond himself is half Swiss and half Scottish, right? And the two people who made Bond most famous, the film producers, one was Italian-American and the other was French-Canadian, right? Not British either. But there is, and much of his interests, much of his adventures, what he drinks, these are all mid-Atlantic rather than British itself. So there's an international aspect to Bond that I think is interesting. What I usually do, and I've given this talk before in one or two places, sort of promoting and talking about the book, is to kick off by asking people whether they all know what a silent disco is. Yeah, everyone knows, right? Yeah, you all have headphones. There's no music that you can hear. And the reason I ask this is it's quite a good idea to kick off just to get everyone to hum the James Bond theme tune in their heads to themselves just for 5 or 6 seconds, right? Nothing out loud, just in your heads, right? When you're ready, go. 5. More or less, I'm guessing everyone in the room could hear it, right? Now, that in itself is quite interesting because there's not many theme tunes to popular franchises that no matter where you come from, what your interests are, that you can hum to yourself, yeah? And whatever we might think about Bond or Fleming's originals books, there is this, and again, global is interesting, there is a global dimension to the popularity of Bond that more or less everyone gets. Not everywhere, but more or less everyone gets. And I think that's what makes it interesting. I should also, before I go to the next slide, I have no idea who the next Bond is going to be. I have no idea what the plot of the next film is going to be, so please don't ask. I'm happy to discuss it, but I've got not the slightest idea. So if anyone was here thinking I'd give something away about the next film, I haven't got a clue. Let me just show some pictures from our conference in Tallinn back in 2019. You can see here that we held it in June 2019, just before the deluge of COVID, and well, things seem to be going relatively well in the world. They seem to be going less well these days. And we met some of our contributors, myself talking there. And out of this conference with my two fellow authors, Dr. Muriel Glave and also Dr. Ron Grineri, neither of whom are here. Muriel's in Vienna and Ron's at the US Army War College just outside of Washington, DC. But it's not a solo project. And one of the other things we needed for the book was the other contributors, the people who wrote the chapters for us. One of whom is here tonight, Jill Bennett, the former Foreign Office historian, who wrote about what realistic traces of Ian Fleming and James Bond can be found in the British archives. Yeah. One of the things we were interested in with this project was not just looking at Bond as a piece of literature or cinema, but also thinking about its impact on intelligence studies, yeah, on studying the nature of espionage. Now, you might think, well, James Bond has nothing to do with the reality of espionage, and you'd be quite right. But of course, the author of the books did know something about that, having worked in naval intelligence. Some of the leading members of the CIA were great fans of James Bond, and Dulles had a collection of the Bond novels behind his desk in the CIA. Now, whether they influenced anything is debatable. Ian Fleming, of course, famously met John F. Kennedy in the early 1960s to discuss, amongst other things, what to do with Fidel Castro. Yeah, well known and well discussed. But the point here is that the influence of Bond reaches beyond just the cultural, right? And of course, there's also a negative reach of Bond. It might be that if you really want to know anything about espionage or the world of intelligence, what you actually do is look at the opposite of Bond, right? Which is equally relevant. But there's a real world dynamic, there's a literature dynamic. And one of the other things that came out of the collection, which we didn't necessarily intend, but was also to look at the reach of James Bond behind the Iron Curtain. It can be presumed that Bond was peculiarly Western. A colleague of mine at the University of Tallinn, Marek Tarm, Professor Marek Tarm, he remembers first watching a Bond film in the mid-1980s when Finnish television would broadcast to Soviet Estonia. So mid-1980s, they first started watching their Bond films in the Soviet Union, right? Not the earliest broadcast or showing of a Bond film in the Soviet Union. The first I've discovered was at the British Embassy in 1977, when Cubby Broccoli went for discussions with Mosfilm, the Soviet film producer, and they showed The Man with the Golden Gun in the British Embassy in Moscow for an invited Soviet delegation. Quite what they made of it, who knows? But Bond was certainly broadcast there. And one of the things we discovered was the way in which the Soviet bloc reacted to Bond. And Bond is not just about the Bond films and movies, but how the rest of the world reacted to Bond and how fictional espionage began to influence what many of us, or the general public, think espionage and quote-unquote spying is or isn't. Not saying that's realistic, but there's a dimension to that there. So those are some of the things there. I'd also mention that myself, Muriel and Ron gave a long interview to the New Books Network about a year ago. Some of you might know the New Books Network, going into more detail about the book and the individual chapters. So if you're interested in that, it's well worth a listen. You can also read a review of the book in the Journal of Cold War Studies, a very generous review by Professor Goodman from the Department of Intelligence Studies at King's College. So if you want to think about the credibility of the volume, you can look it up there. So, as promised, a 7-point plan, right? I'm going to talk to begin with, obviously, about James Bond. The point of the hashtags will become apparent when we get to point 7. Bondology. Perhaps some of you know what Bondology is. Some years ago, when I first started teaching an undergraduate class about James Bond, I wrote a short piece for the Times Higher Educational Supplement about using James Bond in the liberal arts. And slightly tongue-in-cheek, I described myself as a Bondologist. And the editors came back to me and said, well, what are your qualifications for being a Bondologist? I said, well, I have none. I just made the word up. I didn't realize you needed any. But anyway, they let it through. But there is quite a large body of work and study about Bond, which you may or may not be aware of. The Bondiverse, then the Bondian Cold War, which was our focus, thinking about how James Bond reflects and refracts what we think the Cold War was about in a variety of different ways. The anti-Bond, which perhaps is quite poignant today, given the death of Len Deighton yesterday. After all, Len Deighton and much of what he wrote with his fictional espionage hero, Harry Palmer, is a reaction to Fleming. Yeah, and a lot of espionage fiction or cinema or all these other things, there's a sort of two polar opposites or two extremes that they vary from. One is the sort of the Bond, the fantasy, the fast cars, the martinis, and the other is the more realistic, or seemingly more realistic. Whether Len Deighton is really more realistic than Ian Fleming is debatable. Banal Bond, which I'll come on to explain, and then forget James Bond at the end. Yeah, I've put a picture here of Sir Harold Wilson, the former British Prime Minister, talking there at the James Bond studio in Elstree. And I've put that up there with Roger Moore, of course, he's from The Spy Who Loved Me, or during the filming of it, because in many respects, what Bond is really about, certainly in a British context, is about the British film industry. It's not about espionage. It's not about fighting communism. It's about the British film industry. And one of the reasons Bond was made in the first place in the early 1960s was because of the tax breaks the British government were giving foreign filmmakers at the time. Yeah, that's why Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman were working in Britain, right? That's why they made Bond here. Without those tax breaks and without that film industry, and the creative arts generate a vast, whatever certain politicians might say, creates a vast amount of income for the British economy, right? It's a vital piece of what Britain does. That soft power is crucial. And I think it's worth, when Bond eventually jumps out of an aeroplane at the London Olympics, seemingly with the Queen, a helicopter, I do apologise, seemingly with the Queen at the London Olympics. He wasn't doing that for his services of the Cold War, right, or what he'd done for British intelligence. He was doing that representing the contributions to the British film industry, which were immense in terms of financial production. So the fact that you have the Prime Minister there is reflective of bearing that in mind. So anyway, number one, right? Here we have Roger Moore, again in the 1970s. For some of you, Roger Moore might be your Bond. I suspect we have a large audience here. Some people might hate Roger Moore. I remember watching Bond films when they started being broadcast on British television, late 70s, I believe, early 1980s, with my dad. My dad spent most of the films going, well, he's not Sean Connery, is he? Right? And depending on what generation you are, which Bond you were first introduced to, by whom, and everyone in this room will have their own story. Yeah, first time you heard of Bond or watched a Bond or read a Bond, everyone has a story. Yeah, you probably have a preferred character that you like watching, right? I quite like Roger Moore, maybe not the best Bond, and there's a heated discussion that is largely pointless, to be honest. And of course, there will be a new one coming along. Two statements here. Here's Sean Connery on the famous beach in Jamaica during the filming of the first Bond, Dr. No. Yeah, I could have put Ursula Andress coming out of the sea, but I thought I'd show this picture. Two statements here, one of which is true, one of which is false. I'll give you just a couple of seconds to think about which is which. It's obviously the first one that's false and the second one that's true, right? James Bond was not a spy, right? Whereas, at least in the fictional world of James Bond, he does have a license to kill. Now, in the real world, members of the Secret Intelligence Service don't have a license to kill, right? But nevertheless, in the fictional world, he does. But what he's not is a spy. And I think it's quite useful to begin with thinking about why he's not a spy. Yeah, I mean, to start with, this is just about basic terminology. If he was working for MI6, as it's more commonly known, yeah, he would be an intelligence officer. Yeah, they're the ones who recruit spies. He might do a bit of spying now and again, but the job of the intelligence officer is to recruit spies. He's not a spy by definition. Yeah. But also at the same time, it's fairly obvious if you've read the books or watched the films, he's a really rubbish spy, right? Because not least in nearly every, less so in the books, but certainly in the films, he introduces who he is, yeah, with his own name. That's not a very good way of thinking about a spy. You know, so thinking about Bond as a spy, although we all commonly say it, right? It's something we all talk about, yeah? He's not, yeah? I want to argue on the next slide that he's in fact something slightly different and possibly more disturbing, yeah? One other thing about this picture of the beach, when they were filming this particular scene in Jamaica, Ian Fleming and his wife Anne were on the beach watching the filming. Yeah, Ian Fleming was alive for the making of the first 2-3 films before he dies, 1964, 65. Yeah, but he and his wife are actually hiding in the dunes for that scene behind the beach itself. Jamaica is the epicenter for Bond. It's not London, it's not Britain. The novels were written in Ian Fleming's villa in Jamaica. Yeah, that's where it's created. Certainly for those of you who've read the novels, know many of them are set in Jamaica and the Caribbean and in the United States. London and Britain very rarely figures. Also, interestingly, you know, Central and Eastern Europe and the Soviet bloc rarely figure. James Bond hardly ever goes to the Soviet Union or behind the Iron Curtain in any of the novels, right? If you're not sure about that, think about the plots for a moment and it will occur to you. Yeah, he does occasionally, yeah, but not very often. Rather than thinking of Bond as a spy, he's more accurately probably an assassin. Yeah, Fleming used this term a blunt instrument, yeah, or some sort of special operator. Yeah, after all, James Bond's autobiography that we get glancingly in the books is that he worked in naval intelligence. Yeah. that he was actually a soldier working for naval intelligence, and that was his real job rather than an intelligence officer. And in some ways, that's a way of thinking. You've got Sean Connery there from, if I remember correctly, the beginning of Goldfinger. Yeah, he's got a dead swan, or what is that? A seabird of some description on his head, comes ashore and then blows up the sort of oil tanks on the shore. This is an act of sabotage. Yeah? This is not what spies or intelligence officers do. Yeah, you have Daniel Craig doing much the same in his last film before he's obliterated by a British Royal Naval frigate, I believe the same one they're now sending to the Middle East. And also, and just in case you think, well, that's unrealistic, that's something that didn't happen. Well, of course, that's something that Ian Fleming himself was doing during the Second World War. Some of you might be familiar with the Special Operations Executive. I noticed that the Royal United Services Institute just had an article this week about whether the SOE is going to be reconstructed under the new head of MI6. The answer is that it's unlikely. But this idea of sending people behind enemy lines to blow things up or to assassinate people is not fantasy. It's not from novels. It did occur. One of the ones I think is interesting, which I must say I thought was fantasy, was the person at the top there. He's jumping out of a plane with a nuclear bomb strapped to him, right? Seems like something from a Bond novel, yeah? And when I first saw that photograph or first saw descriptions, I thought, that can't be real. I mean, they may have done it once or twice, but no. There was an actual American unit whose job in World War III was to be parachuted behind enemy lines with nuclear bombs strapped to them to blow up dams, right? Sounds unlikely, but they trained for it. Wow. I suspect it would have been a one-way trip if you're blowing up a dam with a nuclear bomb, but that was there, and it seems remarkable, seems unlikely. But I think it reflects something about this blurred line between the silliness or presumed silliness of Bond and the presumed silliness of these other worlds, and also hammers home the point that he's not a spy in the way we would think about it. Although we say James Bond, we should think which Bond? Yeah. There are 271 Bond stories and 28 distinct different incarnations of Bond across novels, movies, TV, games and comics between 1953 and 2019. So that's 5 or 6 years ago. We can add another 10, 15, 20 to that. Yeah. How many of those are you familiar with? Yeah. Take away the 25 movies, take away the 6 novels, 2 collections of short stories. Yeah. You're probably still about 250 short, right? So when we're thinking about, oh, I know Bond, yes, I've seen all the movies, I know it all. Well, okay, there's a lot more going on there. Now, I'm not saying they're all of equal quality, yeah? But there's a vast Bondiverse in different eras, in different places that's still ongoing, yeah? We just recently saw Daniel Craig, and for those of you who saw the last Bond film, I hope I'm not giving anything away. You might want to shut your ears if you haven't seen it. He dies at the end, yeah? Not the first time Bond has died, of course, and he's being resurrected. But in the meanwhile, Bond has appeared in numerous novels, comics in the 1950s, in the present day, in the Second World War, in computer games. He's still there, right? So which Bond is it that you're thinking about, right? Because there's a multiplicity of Bonds, yeah? The Bondiverse, right? There's lots of them working all at the same time. Some of them have died at various points, but many of them have not. And these 4 gentlemen to the left, which I suspect are fairly familiar to most of you, yeah, in some ways are the ones responsible for either creating the first literary Bond, Ian Fleming, sitting down there with, of course, a cigarette, and, of course, Cubby Broccoli, Saltzman, and behind them, Sean Connery, the man who made Bond and sort of triggered Bond mania in the 1960s, yeah. That's the Bond we think of, but it's not the only one, right? Nor was it the first, yeah? Obviously, the literary Bond precedes Sean Connery, but Sean Connery wasn't the first person to play Bond on screen either, yeah? Bond first appeared on screen in 1953 in the United States on television, yeah? As Jimmy Bond, a CIA agent, yeah? It's you can find it on YouTube if you're interested. It's really not very good. Yeah, it doesn't work very well, but it's fascinating. And that was because Ian Fleming had sold the film rights to Casino Royale immediately after publishing the book. And that's why you don't get another Casino Royale until 1968, the comedy with Woody Allen, and then all the way until Eon Productions buy back the rights for Casino Royale in the 21st century. Yeah? I mention all this because Ian Fleming selling the rights to the Bond novels and who he sold them to is part of the story of how we know Bond and how Bond got made and nearly didn't get made. Because I think the other thing that's interesting about Bond is how unlikely the success of Bond actually was. Fleming's novels were not that popular in the 1950s. They really take off in the 1960s, especially after President John F. Kennedy said that he liked From Russia with Love. I've still not seen any precise evidence that he ever read it or did indeed like it, but it was claimed that he had. And also because of the films themselves. The novels could have just disappeared, another collection of pulp fiction that some people enjoyed, but if the films hadn't been made, they would have just disappeared. We probably wouldn't be here talking about them. Yeah? Dr. No only just got made, and it wasn't supposed to be the first script. Yeah? It was accidental that it got made at the time that it did, and it was also pure chance and accident that it came out just before the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yeah? Just in the same way that Len Deighton's first novel came out just before the Cuban Missile Crisis, that piqued people's interest in these things, right? So they're some of the people who are behind some of the Bonds, but not all of them, but certainly the ones we think of. Here's another three people, including Len Deighton, who are responsible for other Bonds. Sean Connery, again, a rare photo of him without his Bond wig, right? Len Deighton there with the glasses, and a name you might not know or might be less familiar with, Kevin McClory. And Kevin McClory's name is just as important and as vital in the story as Bond as anyone else. Because Kevin McClory worked with Ian Fleming in the late 1950s to write a script for something called Thunderball, which pro rata still is the most popular Bond film, right? In terms of income, right? Pro rata, I notice I say. But Kevin McClory is the person who then sued Ian Fleming for the rights to that, because Ian Fleming then published a book called Thunderball that he didn't own the rights to. Ended up in court. There's a big court case, right? Fleming doesn't quite lose, but McClory keeps the rights. This is why Sean Connery could come back in the 1980s and make his rival Bond film, Never Say Never Again, which some of you may have seen, which is a remake of Thunderball. Yeah. So there's two Bonds, right? Already. There's the official Bond canon and the non-official canon. And it's only after McClory died that, again, Eon was able to buy back the rights to an organization that McClory claimed that he created, Spectre. Yeah? He claimed he created that. That was part of the case. Whether that's really the case, you know, is open to debate. Ian Fleming was a rare book collector, and he had an original edition of Karl Marx, The Communist Manifesto. Yeah, you may recall that the Spectre is mentioned in the first line of that, right? Fleming certainly argued that he was the one who came up with it. But these court cases, when you look at gaps in when Bond films are being made or when Bond films don't get made, chances are there's some legal trouble in the background, right? Whether it's the selling of MGM Studios in the 1980s, 1990s, when there's about an 8-year gap between films, it's because of legal troubles, right? They've now sold it to Amazon for, I believe, $1 billion, right? Fair enough. Yeah, we'll see what Amazon do with it. But these legal troubles are always there. So some of these characters are behind, you know, some of these Bonds. No women? I think there are some really important women involved in the Bond story. The first is Dana Broccoli, the ex-wife or former wife of Albert Broccoli before she died, not least because she seems, from most of the accounts and biographies and interviews that we have, to be the person who convinced her husband to employ Sean Connery, because he wasn't too keen. Ian Fleming wasn't keen on Sean Connery either, Yeah, didn't think he looked anything like Bond. He was well, there's a whole range of people he preferred. David Niven was top of the list for him. Would have Dr. No worked with David Niven? I mean, he was a lovely actor, but I'm not sure he had the same appeal. And also Barbara Broccoli, of course, his daughter, who then starts working on the films in the 1970s and carries the franchise forward. Probably names we're familiar with. Maybe here's a name you're less familiar with. Yeah, Joanna Harwood. Yeah, she was one of the script editors on Dr. No, and has recently, I don't want to be sort of, rediscovered is perhaps unfair, but played an important role of knocking the script into shape. Not least as early script versions had Dr. No as a talking monkey. I kid you not, right? That was an early version, right? Various other versions of unmade Bond film scripts have equally bizarre plots, including kidnapping the Pope in one of them. It's a whole range of material on these, but she plays an important role, largely unsung role, yeah? Although her name does appear on the poster there equally. And for the first 2-3 films, her role in the background is there. So, when we think about Bond, we tend to think about Bond girls in a perhaps throwaway or slightly dismissive way. But I think it's important to recognise that there's some important women behind there as well. Moving on to Bondology, right? The study of Bond, right? Now, you might not think this is a very serious thing to do, and I still feel slightly apologetic for coming along and wasting an hour of your time talking about James Bond, however interesting it is. But it is quite a serious subject. One of the things we were trying to do in the book was to bring together a number of different strands. Yeah, Bond on the page, Bond on the screen, Bond in the real world, the relationship with the real intelligence services and espionage, and to bring these together. Not all Bondology does that. And certainly this idea of taking Bond seriously, I've chosen a particularly important photo there from Octopussy to illustrate this, comes from the scholar James Chapman, who wrote about the Bond novels. Yeah. And he argued that Bond, whatever you think about Bond, whatever you think about its representations, certainly many problematic representations in the novels and films, it is worthy of serious study. Yeah, in the way that a lot of popular culture is worthy of serious study. Right, these are important aspects, but also because Bond does have an influence on the way in which we, generally in this room, tend to think about espionage, international intrigue, yeah, geopolitics, not necessarily correctly in any formal way, but it is an influential sort of process. The Bondology literature is across a variety of different disciplines. I'll come on and highlight some of those. And for us, as we were all Cold War historians, myself, Muriel and Ron, what we were particularly interested in was the Cold War dimension. Yeah, I suppose in one way that question can be summarized as, do we think about Bond as part of the Kulturkampf of the Cold War? Cold War culture as a conflict or as an item of Cold War culture? Right, it's not quite the same thing. There's a differentiation there. Yeah, wide array. I'm not going to go through all the books, but some of them might be interesting. Kingsley Amis is his James Bond dossier, written in the 1960s. Amis hated the films, couldn't stand them. Yeah, and he loved the novels. And he wrote a whole book about how much he loved the novels and how they're a great piece of British literature. Pushing it slightly, perhaps, yeah. But nevertheless, if you want to read someone who really knows about novels backwards and forwards, Kingsley Amis's dossier is a good one. Not least because he writes the first continuation novel, right? After Fleming dies, the first continuation novel is written by Kingsley Amis. Umberto Eco. Name you may have heard of, not necessarily someone you expect to be writing about Bond, but his breakdown of Bond is remarkable and is brilliant, yeah? And he's a serious scholar writing in the 1960s about James Bond, right? So there's quite a lineage to this. Some of the others, some of our contributors, Lisa Funnell, about the women of James Bond, Klaus Dodds down the bottom here as well, James Chapman I've mentioned. There's even an international journal, peer-reviewed journal of James Bond studies, right? So there are people taking this seriously. And Len Deighton again pops up. One of the last books or novellas, short books that he ever wrote was about his interaction not only with Fleming and Broccoli, but also with, you know, the rival Bonds as well, and is quite interesting. Yeah. Two others of our contributors, Tarek and Philip, have just recently written Bond-related books that I would recommend. One of which I've just reviewed in the English Historical Review, and the other Philip's book I'm late with reviewing. But anyway, in the process of. Tarek looks at Bond rivals in East Germany, Poland and the Soviet Union in the 1960s and 1970s on television and on film. What's interesting is he's been in the archives and how often these responses are direct responses to the Bond films. It's not accidental. They're trying to make a socialist response to Bond. Now, whatever you might think about that, that's what they were actively doing. How successful it was. And in Philip's book about former KGB agents writing spy novels or detective novels, this was actually triggered by a directive from Andropov, the head of the KGB, who dictated that winning the cultural Cold War was important and we should be writing spy novels too. Now, in the long run, that didn't quite work out as he hoped. But nevertheless, again, the point being that novels of adventure, spy thrillers, right, are not just something British, right? I don't want to say they're global or universal, but we can see them in all various different parts of the world. The next slide, some of you might recognize one of the persons in this slide, some of you might not. If you look to the right of the picture, you might recognize who that is. Does anyone want to shout out? Verich, of course, and I've had to write it in there because I might say Voskowitz. But Verich, very briefly, who you'll know from his tenure as a, what should we call him, comedian in the interwar Czechoslovak First Republic, very briefly was the Bond villain. Right? He didn't last very long, and I haven't found much evidence about why he was replaced by Donald Pleasance at the end of the film, but he does turn up there briefly, and I'll come on to some other Czechoslovak connections with Bond in a minute. But I thought I'd put up there. And of course, this is the classic you only live twice, missiles, nuclear weapons, right? Megalomaniacs in volcanoes. These are what were the hallmarks of what we think about Bond, which are partly about the Cold War, but partly not. Yeah, and this is one of the peculiarities of the Bondian Cold War. Bond is far less about the Cold War than we might immediately think. Yeah, some of it is about about the Cold War, and some of the early novels are explicitly about that. But even Ian Fleming himself writes in letters, in his memoirs, in interviews and articles, by about 57, 58, it might sound a little odd to us now, but he thought the Cold War was about to come to an end. And he thought writing adventure stories where communists were the baddies wouldn't sell, right? That's what he thought, right? You can agree, you can disagree, that's up to you, but that's what he thought, right? What he thought was we should have some sort of enemy that's not related to the realities of politics. Why? Financial longevity of the product, right? Fleming was in it partly for the money, right? He wasn't writing this as art. He's very open. He goes, I write for fun and I write to make money. Yeah, fair enough, right? No problem with that. Also, of course, Broccoli and Saltzman were also very keen not to make the Bond films anti-communist propaganda. Why? Because then you couldn't sell it so widely. And there's a reason why Broccoli had gone to Moscow in 1977 that I mentioned earlier. He wanted to work with Mosfilm to make a Bond film behind the Iron Curtain. As bizarre as that might sound, right? But that's what he said he wanted to do. Mosfilm had other ideas. They wanted Broccoli to make a biopic of John Reed, the American communist who wrote 10 Days That Shook the World, right? Why Mosfilm would think Cubby Broccoli would ever make that, I don't know. Or why Broccoli thought he would sell Bond behind the Iron Curtain, I don't know either. But there's evidence for this, right? And of course, these are products. This is the entertainment business, right? This is why we have to be cautious of thinking that this was some sort of propaganda campaign. Whatever some more contemporary historians have written about Bond's role in winning the Cold War, right? I think we have to be a little cautious here. That's not to say that Bond was in any way politically neutral, yeah? But especially in the films, they depoliticize it on purpose. And if you think about more recent Hollywood or popular movies in the same genre, think how many of them don't have named enemies. Yeah, whether it's the Top Gun films, yeah, or Tom Cruise Mission Impossible films. Who are the enemies in these things? Yeah, they leave it vague, right? That's not necessarily a reflection of the politics of the producers or the filmmakers. It's about the selling of the film. Yeah, that if you make it overtly political, you may not be able to sell it everywhere. Now, that's not crystal clear. That doesn't work everywhere. We can think of plenty of films which are political, right? That also sell and are very popular. But the producers of Bond in the Cold War and the writers of Bond took this sort of middle view, this flexible, fluid view in the Cold War. That's why you have Spectre. That's why you have Blofeld. That's why you have these sort of, Bondian villains in their volcanoes or under the sea. Yeah, that's why they're replaced by the realities of the Cold War, right? I mean, others took a different view. John le Carré took a different view. These were popular, they sold well. Yeah, Len Deighton took a different view. These were popular and they sold well. But for Bond, they took a commercial decision not to be overtly political. I mean, they do get more political in the 1980s, yeah? And it's the 1980s Bonds where we're the only time we see two actual real political historical characters, one of which is Margaret Thatcher, the other of which is Brezhnev. These are the only two characters that ever turn up in the Bond films. Going on a bit long, so maybe I'll skip over these, but I mean, I think it's worth just reminding ourselves that the novels were all written during the Cold War, or at least published in the Cold War. And these are the films for our book that we were particularly interested in. We do go up to GoldenEye in 1995, not least because that starts back in the Cold War, right? And it's a reboot. I mean, there's that 6-year period between the end of the last Timothy Dalton film and the next Pierce Brosnan one. Again, this is to do with the selling of MGM Studios, yeah? Eon and Bond enters a legal limbo for 6 years. That's why there's a gap. And also, of course, many people thought Bond would not come back after the Cold War. Yeah, Cold War product, he wouldn't work after the Cold War, right? It's finished. He did. Now, I mean, what's interesting here, perhaps outside the scope of our book, is did he come back and have another 10, 20 years of lifespan after that? Because it wasn't rooted in the Cold War. Right? Because he becomes a hero for a heroless age, and I'll come on and explain where I got that quote from in a minute, yeah? That he becomes more of a Phantomus or a Sherlock Holmes, right? Rather than rooted in political reality. I'm not entirely sure about that, but it's worth thinking about. One other thing, just very quickly on that list, look at how they don't match up. The books don't match the order in which the films were made. Again, this is for legal reasons largely. The disputes over Thunderball, right? The fact that Casino Royale was sold first, yeah? And that they didn't have the rights to that. And of course, quite rapidly, by the time you get to the mid-1970s, they eventually run out of books. Just for a couple of slides, I want to say a few things, given that I'm in the Czech embassy, talking to the British Czech and Slovak Association. One or two things about it, sort of the Czechoslovak connections, which are pretty sparse. We saw very earlier, right? Ian Fleming never went to Czechoslovakia, as far as I'm able to establish. He did spend time in the Soviet Union. He did know Russian to a certain extent. He was in the Soviet Union for the purges of the mid-1930s. He went back again just before the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1941 with the British delegation. So he knew a little about the Soviet Union. Quite how far we can go with that is debatable. He said, John le Carré has far more connection with Czechoslovakia than Ian Fleming does, right? Czechoslovakia features a lot more. But there are one or two, not necessarily to do with Fleming, but probably more to do with the producers. We have Kronstein, yeah? Not a particularly Czech name as far as I can tell, yeah? Any more than Karla Milovi. Who's supposed to be Slovak, is a particularly Slovak name, right? Doesn't strike me as either. But here are two Czechoslovak characters. One, an Eastern European baddie, as many of them are in the films and the books, right? The baddest of all Ian Fleming's baddies are always Eastern Europeans pretending to be British. It's the worst crime you can commit, according to Ian Fleming, right? Certainly Drax in Moonraker. Right? It's the worst thing, and you can tell he's not real Brit because he cheats at cards in the club, right? That's the giveaway. Whether that's accurate or not is highly debatable. Perhaps a less well-known one is Yaroslav Horak. Not sure if anyone's heard of Horak before, but he wrote the James Bond cartoon strips for many years, from 1966 until the 1980s. Born in China, lived in Australia, right? Quite a life, Czech-Russian background. Not a name. I was just in the bookshop in Piccadilly the other week with my kids because they wanted to look at cartoon books. And I saw this on a shelf, so I thought take a photo of it. Because we don't tend to think about the cartoons that were in the Daily Express. Huge, I don't want to say they're more popular with the books, but they certainly in their time helped the popularity of the books. And they're one aspect of the Bondian world that's perhaps been forgotten. Few Czechoslovak locations, yeah. I particularly like this one, the Strahov Monastery, stands in for the House of Commons. You think they could have done a little more with that, but anyway, fair enough. My colleague Muriel has written about this Coca-Cola advert, Bond advert, that was produced during the Skyfall advertising campaign. You can see the National Theatre in the background. It also features quite heavily Cafe Slavia. And Muriel was convinced that this was somehow related to anti-communism, to the dissident movement, to Havel, right? And thought, wow, this is fantastic, how brilliant. Unlock the 007 in you. Whoever made this must have been thinking about this. And she eventually tracked down the advertising company who made it, which turned out to be French. Got hold of the director and he said, no, it was just cheap to film in Prague, so we did it there. Which is a bit of a shame, but that's why it ended up there. The top one is from The Living Daylights, Timothy Dalton's first movie. And as many of you will be familiar with, you can see this is the mountainous, snowy border between Bratislava and Vienna. Yeah? No, of course it's not. It's flat as a pancake. I know it's flat and you can go by taxi. But in the Bondian world, it's mountainous and snowy. Right. I'd like to take credit for, noticing this, but it was a Czechoslovak colleague some years ago at a conference for the British Czech and Slovak Historians Forum in Oxford, who gave a paper on, my God, how can they have a whole story where you've got this mountainous border between Bratislava and Vienna? It's absurd. But of course, the geography of Bond is no more realistic than their background of espionage. The anti-Bond. Perhaps one of the most interesting aspects of Bond is the reactions that Bond triggered, yeah? And reactions to them. I've already talked about a variety of these. This is a Soviet film called The Deadly Season. And one of our colleagues also, we have a chapter on this. It was filmed in Tallinn in the 1960s. Tallinn and Riga were used by Soviet filmmakers because they looked quote unquote Western. Yeah, it's also where the Soviet version of Sherlock Holmes was filmed, I think in the 1970s. Yeah, But this is an example, not least because at the beginning they've got some clips of London in the late 1960s that a Soviet film crew had made. And whether on purpose or accidentally, there's actually a clip of a cinema showing a Bond film in the beginning of this one. We don't know whether that was intentional or not, but it's certainly there. We'll come back to the Soviets. Len Deighton, the Ipcress trial, Michael Caine, of course, classic in the 90s. But again, actively and intrinsically anti-Bond, the opposite to Bond, more realistic. John le Carré there with Richard Burton, There's a whole genre of espionage or spy thrillers. I mean, they don't start in the 1960s, obviously. They go back far into the 1930s, if not earlier. But many of those writing thrillers, recently with our book club, we reread Graham Greene's The Human Factor from 1979. I'd forgotten how many Bond references there are in that. Even Graham Greene's referencing Bond all the way through. The real SIS is not like Bond. It mentions it about 6 times. Now that's Graham Greene. Whatever we might think about Ian Fleming's literary abilities, Graham Greene was a great writer, right? So it's certainly there. And when we think about the spy, about espionage, there's a triggering via Bond of an international upsurge in novels and films and all sorts of other things. They're varying qualities. But certainly I think with someone or 2 writers like Deighton and le Carré, you have a real quality there. That perhaps is, maybe I'm being a little harsh on Fleming. I quite enjoy reading Fleming, but given a choice, I'd probably rather read a Deighton or a John le Carré, right? In terms of literary style. And whether they're more realistic, of course, is highly questionable. Whether they really represent the reality of day-to-day life as an intelligence officer, as with all fiction, that's questionable. You also have an upsurge. There's a Casino Royale I mentioned. I haven't mentioned the United States, and I should, not least because my colleague Ron wrote his chapter about American reactions to Bond. After all, Bond would never have become popular without American audiences. Bond mania was first triggered in the United States with the first couple of films, right? And if it hadn't been popular in the United States, it would never have taken off anywhere else. By the end of the 60s, it's popular in places like Japan, around the world. But that early interest in Bond is really an American thing, right? And this is why Bond is a mid-Atlantic character. That's why he's not specifically British. That's why he drinks martinis. It's not a British drink. The martini is invented in San Francisco at the end of the 19th century. Dutch gin, French vermouth, Italian olive or lemon. What's British about that? Nothing. It's a mid-Atlantic drink. It's an American drink. He doesn't drink them in the books, right? In the books, he drinks champagne mainly. But we think of the martini, shaken, not stirred, right? In most of the films, except one occasion, right? But that's a quintessentially non-British drink. Fleming wrote a hilarious piece, which I think he must have been just doing it so he could get American tourists beaten up. I can't think of any other reason he would do it. For an American travel magazine in the early 60s, telling American tourists coming to London that they could get a martini made in any London pub. Now, can you imagine going into a London pub as an American tourist in the early 60s and asking the barman or the landlord to make you a martini? Right? I don't know what would have happened. Even today, I wouldn't go into a pub and ask for a martini. What on earth would you get? But he wrote this and it was popular and it's there. I think the interesting thing about the American response is how America fails to come up with their own Bond in the 60s. They come up with spy series, they come up with comedies, but they never come up with a genuine Bondian rival, right? It's not until the 1990s with the reboot of Mission Impossible, Jason Bourne in the early 2000s, that really you get the American espionage hero. You get comedy ones, you get TV series, but there's no genuine American rival. Plenty of novels, right? But not on the screen. Arguably, the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc was more popular and more successful, although many of these were set during the Second World War, The Sword and the Shield, 17 Moments of Spring, Bulgarian novel there, in which the Bulgarian spy hero kills James Bond. All right? Suggested this was sparked by the KGB to write this. I'm not seeing any credible evidence to support that. It's interesting that they don't call it 007 because they were threatened by being sued by Eon if they did. Now, even the Bulgarian Communist Party in the 1970s was a bit worried about being sued by Eon, which is interesting. Yeah, we're back to those commercial dynamics of Bond, right? Which I think is worth bearing in mind. Really interesting character is Maria Taraskova here. And she wrote a short essay in the late 1960s where she referred to Bond as the hero of the unheroic epoch, which I can't help feeling is a bit apt for today's world too. Yeah, and it raises some, now it wasn't published immediately, but it is out there. I'm not sure if there's any English translations. I'm grateful to some former students and to some colleagues for translating and finding copies of it for me in Moscow. Yeah. But the fact that Soviet film critics were writing about Bond and presumably reading and seeing Bonds, big debate about exactly were. Certainly Pravda and the Soviet press was reading about Bond, and there's a recent book by one of Bond's relatives about their reactions, negative as you would expect. Yeah, but there's a difference between what the official press was writing and what others were writing. And I'll sort of perhaps go a little faster because I've probably taken most of my time already and we haven't got through all 7 points. Arguably one of the most interesting, and the New York Times, presumably when it was still a credible newspaper, once upon a time called this the best spy series in television history. Late 1970s. We also have a chapter from my colleague Joseph in the book about this. If you've never seen it or never heard it, I would strongly recommend you look it up, right? Can be bought on DVD, it is on YouTube. Yeah. Again, it's another reaction to Bond, and I suspect, given the time it was made, maybe a reaction to the success of the first Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy series on the BBC. Yeah. But again, it's part of that reaction to Bond that's, again, I use global hesitantly, yeah, but there's a global reaction to Bond all around the world. Little faster now, the Bondiverse. I'm guessing most people haven't seen the cartoon James Bond Jr. I wouldn't go out of your way to watch it. It is truly shockingly bad. But it is a part of the official Bond canon. Yeah, it was produced by In Productions. Yeah, it is quite awful. Yeah, tried a 007 hamburger? Probably not. There are 007 amusement rides. I think at least 3 were made over the last 20, 30 years of varying levels of credibility. Wide array of succession novels, of comics. Kim Sherwood's trilogy about Bond is the most recent. I think a most recent one has just been published now. They come out of the Ian Fleming Literary Agency, not of Eon. Yeah, the Succession novels, Colonel Sun. What I would mention, which is really interesting, John Pearson, used to work with Fleming, and he wrote one of the first biographies of Fleming. The most recent was by Nicholas Shakespeare, if you're interested. Yeah, but he also wrote the authorized biography of James Bond, in which Ian Fleming writes Bond as a trick to trick the Soviets into thinking Bond is fake. I think it's one of the best continuation novels of Bond that Fleming didn't write. And sadly, it's one of the ones that most people haven't read. It is widely available. If you get a chance, I think you find it enjoyable. It's very interesting. I mean, they vary, but they're out there. Computer games. One of my colleagues, when we were planning this at the University of Tallinn, we were in the pub after a couple of pints, and he rather sheepishly said to me, he goes, you know, I'd never heard of the Bond films or Bond books. He goes, but I did know the computer game, GoldenEye. Hugely successful. One of the most successful computer games of the last 30 years. Yeah, don't know how many computer game players we have in the room, but take my word for it, right? And he says, I was playing GoldenEye one day at home and my mum comes in and says, what are you playing? He goes, well, I'm playing James Bond. And she goes, oh, have you seen the films? And he goes, films? What films? Many of us in this room know the novels, know the films. There's entire generations of people out there who didn't start with them, right? Might seem peculiar to you, but people enter into the Bondiverse through a variety of different routes, good, bad, or indifferent, yeah? But anyway, the cartoons I've already mentioned, this an early version by John McCluskey. And again, banal Bond is really, and I've put, with apologies to Michael Billig, who wrote a wonderful book about banal nationalism, the way that nationalism is communicated not through propaganda or schooling, but just everyday symbols we see around us. What's interesting to me is the way in which Bond has just now entered the lexicon all over the place. This is an article about Brixmith, which is a British organisation that had the legal right to go into East Germany during the Cold War. I think unfortunately Collins left, who was briefly a member of Brexit, who was in the audience. And they talk about Scruffy 007, right? It's got nothing to do with 007, but it's always interesting, any book about Bond, whether it's fiction, whether it's intelligence studies, yeah, whether it's by former members of the intelligence services, look for the Bond reference. I guarantee you it's in there somewhere. Yeah. Usually, especially if they work for the intelligence services, it was nothing like Bond. Bond is rubbish. Had nothing to do with it. Yeah. But there will be a Bond reference. Yeah. The former head of GCHQ recently wrote a book about his experiences. Bond is mentioned twice. I checked. Yeah. It's always in there. Yeah. And you find it at all sorts of places. The Finnish Stockmann department store in Tallinn. Yeah. Has a 007 Belvedere martini for, I never tried it, but it's certainly on the menu. A cocktail, I can't remember the name of the cocktail club, which is just around the corner somewhere here in London. You can try Bondian cocktails if you have a spare 500 quid, I'm sure many of you do, from the 1960s. They sell Bondian merchandise, which, goes from the bizarre to even more bizarre as far as I can tell. But anyway, it's everywhere. More relevantly, Bondian villains, right? Just for the next couple of weeks, every time you open a newspaper, do we have newspapers anymore? Switch on your computer, yeah? Scroll through the news, right? Look how often you can find reference to Bondian villains, yeah? Might be Elon Musk these days rather than Vladimir Putin, right? But nevertheless, the way in which, Bondian architecture, just keep your eyes peeled for a couple of weeks. You'll suddenly see it everywhere, yeah? Pops up all the time. And finally, more or less finally, yeah, I think it is finally, the response of the intelligence services and intelligence studies to Bond more generally. And I've put Forget James Bond down on here because this was what the former head of the Secret Intelligence Service came up with as a hashtag, yeah? When Twitter was still viable and still going, which is 3 or 4 years ago now, I suppose. And certainly at the time when we were writing the book and soon after, I saw interviews with the heads of the British, French and Russian External Intelligence Service, all of which referenced James Bond in their interviews with credible news agencies. Now, all of them said, nothing to do with us, it's rubbish. But every single one mentioned them. That's what's interesting. Why on earth do you feel the need to mention him? Yeah, no need to. Of course, they want to, because there's a connection that's beneficial to them there too. Yeah, it's more of a complex relationship, yeah, than you might think. Some of you might remember this Chinese propaganda from a couple of years ago. I don't think it's widely available now, but they made a spoof Bond critiquing the British intelligence services, right? Using Bond, of course, right? Because that's what they think of the British. Yeah. So that, real Bond is somewhat difficult. I mean, I've put this quote up here from Oleg Gordievsky, who claims that the Soviet Politburo watched all the Bond films when they came out and he had to source them. I think this is quite unlikely, to be honest. And given at that time they were being shown on television, you could buy them on VHS, if you remember what VHS was. or Betamax, or your tape of preference. I think that's highly unlikely, but there's the quote. I've also put Margaret Thatcher in or the impersonator of Margaret Thatcher, because we have a chapter on Margaret Thatcher and also Octopussy, and the way in which politics enters into the Bonds in the late 1980s. And also because the Dennis Thatcher there is, breaking the fourth wall. I think it's the only time it happens in a Bond film. Yeah, not quite sure why. Well, no, there's another occasion, maybe the second time, but it's just a delicious scene. And again, the reality of espionage in the Cold War is even more bizarre. Yeah, I won't go through all of those, and even after. But the Azoran project, where the CIA built a whole ship to pick up a nuclear submarine off the seabed of the Pacific, one of the most expensive activities the CIA ever did in the Cold War, seems straight out of a James Bond plot, but was real. I don't want to go too far with this. I don't want to suggest for a moment that there's reality. But then the reality of what really happens often seems more bizarre. Yeah, we can think of more recent examples, I don't know, including pagers or things like that, right, that come to mind. Yeah, so we might not dismiss it quite as ridiculous as we might seem. And I am there with Daniel Craig with the Queen. The London Olympics 2012, which on the face of it is really odd. If we accept Bond is an assassin, a misogynist, a representative of the British Empire, all sorts of other things, what on earth is he doing with the Queen, right? Global British propaganda during the Olympics, which is what it was, right? Fair enough. I mean, propaganda in the neutral term. We tend to think of it negatively, but there's good propaganda too. Yeah, and of course, it's not about what he did. It's not about the British intelligence services. It's about what he did for the British film industry above all else, right? Because Bond and Beatles in the 1960s, this was the soft power recovery of Britain after the loss of empire in the 1950s and 60s, right? And I think that's worth bearing in mind. And that's certainly why I stood with the Queen. But I think I've gone on too far. Hopefully there's some interesting stuff there. And maybe if we have some Q&As, I can answer any other questions you may have.
Could I have the mic just for Martin, thank you very much indeed for that extremely lively presentation. I will never watch a James Bond film in the same way again.
Oh, please do. Don't be put off.
But it does make me think of more seriously about a TV program that was, 2-3 years ago, showing how trainees for MI5 are selected, and the whole question of shooting, and the point you made that they do not have license to kill
of course not.
At all. Or perhaps I shouldn't kill that image. Do we have any questions, please? Oh, I think you were first, the gentleman there. Oh, thank you, Ivana.
Thank you, and thanks for a wonderful talk. The question I had was, given the huge value of the Bond franchise, what led them to kill him off in the last film?
Slightly outside the purview, but as far as we have from the interviews with Daniel Craig, this was a deal he made with Barbara Broccoli during the first film. He said, I will play Bond, I will do 3 or 4 films, but I want to die at the end. Why he decided to say that and why they decided to accept, I think we might have to wait a little longer to find out. Although it is interesting, we probably know now more about the Státní bezpečnost or the KGB than we do about the internal workings of Eon Productions in the 1960s, because their information and their documentation has not been released, right? The really big question of Bond previously was why they didn't pay Sean Connery more at the end of the 1960s, yeah, because then he would have stayed, right? But it seems to be that Daniel Craig said he wanted to die at the end of the last film, And they thought, all right, we can do this. I mean, Bond has died before, right? Sherlock Holmes dies,
Yes.
right, and comes back.
Yeah.
This is not unheard of. This is a fictional character. Now, how they'll bring him back and what they'll do, we'll find out. Or if they're sensible, they just ignore everything and just start again, right? Which is what they've done before. But that seems to be the reason why they died at the end, yeah? Whether it worked or not, whether it was a good idea or not, I'm not sure, yeah.
Thank you. There's another question here,
Yeah, thank
please.
you. Very inspiring. My question is whether you think that the James Bond films have, in the popular view of an ordinary person, normalized the killing of the baddies rather than bringing them to court. I mean, we now kill people rather than bring them to court.
Well, that's an interesting question, especially if we think of Bond as an assassin, which I realise is a bit of a leap, but I think it makes more sense than trying to call him a spy. Of course, extrajudicial execution is problematic, to put it mildly, right? Is Bond responsible for that idea?
No, I mean, normalize this in view of humans.
Well, of course, I mean, they certainly do it in the films. What's probably normalized it more over the last 25 years has been the global war on terror.
Yeah.
Right? If we're talking the last few decades. If you want to go back to the 1950s or the 1940s or earlier, it might be other things. But the idea that you execute rather than arrest is certainly not new. It's been around a while. Has it played a role in that? Probably. Has it played a role in glamorizing violence and misogyny? Yup. Yeah. That's without doubt. You know, how big a role, but what audience do we mean, right? Do we mean a British audience? Do we mean a French audience? I didn't tell this story, but when I first started teaching an undergraduate class about Bond, one of the first things I always asked all my students is, why are you doing a course on James Bond, right? What's the origin story for you? How did you get to Bond? And in one of the first classes, we had a young chap from New York, but who was originally from Pakistan, or his father was from northern Pakistan, up by the Afghan border. Yeah. And he said, oh, my dad got me into Bond. I said, oh, how did your dad get into Bond? He goes, well, he lived in a village up by the border of Pakistan. Once a month, the truck would come, they'd hang a sheet from the trees, and they'd show a film. One of them was James Bond at some point or another. Presumably his dad was about my age, right? Now, the fact that they're showing James Bond films in villages in northern Pakistan is interesting. Bond was huge in Chile, right? Bond is huge in Japan, right? So which country do we mean, right? There's a whole range of different audiences. It certainly played a role. I'm not quite sure how we would assess that. Yeah, it's certainly not the only violent movie or the most violent, right? There's a reason why all the Bond films were parental guidance and never 18. Again, it's about audience, right? Because if it was 18, you would limit the audience that could go to see it. You would limit the box office. So the violence was always toned down quite dramatically, although it might not seem it on the screen. Right? Compared to, I think we can think of many more violent films and war films.
I'm not talking about violence, so it's too much violence, or a lot of it. I'm talking about normalizing of the killing
Sure, no.
of the enemy.
Yeah.
Rather than bringing them to
There's probably a role, I'm not quite sure how we would assess that sociologically. I'm sure there's probably an aspect in what you say, but it doesn't start. I mean, Rogue Mail was written in the 1930s about assassinating Hitler. Good idea? Bad idea? I'm being a little flippant. I mean, I get your point. But the idea of assassinating rather than arresting didn't quite start with Bond. But yeah, probably had a role in glamorizing it to some extent.
There's another question here, please.
Here.
Martin, a more light-hearted comment. I expect I'm not the only person in the room for whom one of the unforgettable images of a Bond film is Ursula undressed, coming out of the sea with a gun on her hip. Well, I looked in the paper, in the birthdays column today, and Ursula Andress is 90 today.
Oh,
Thank you.
I intentionally did not include that image, Sir Michael. Whether I should have is debatable. And we were just discussing earlier outside, of course, it's one of 3 occasions where that same image reoccurs. The first is in Dr. No, the later is with Halle Berry, where she comes out of the sea in Cuba, and then the last is with Daniel Craig when he comes out of the sea in the same bikini that she's wearing. So there's a sort of full circle there.
I think we must make it the last question, please.
Yeah, okay, well, President's question is a couple of points. I mean, 2 words that you haven't used are sex and not violence, but humour, both of which are very predominant in the Bond films. There's a lot of sex in the books, which, considering they're written in the 1950s, is perhaps a bit avant-garde for the time. I mean, I'm not certain Bond is really misogynist. I mean, women adore him. I mean, whether you like or not, that they all jump into bed with him. But of course, the humour, the sardonic humour, the jokes, the wisecracks, are purely an invention of the films. And why, I don't know, but they soften it. They obviously make the character more popular. But if you've got any comments on that, I mean, if I could just say that the point, I think, where they both those elements come together is in the film. There's one of the films with Roger Moore, who I think is the weakest Bond. He has to get access to the villain's lair, and the villain's got a couple of women guardians. He gets one of them on the beach and softens her up in inimitable Bond style, and then gets a gun up, holds it to her head, and so says, and then starts talking, and she says, "Oh, you wouldn't pull that trigger out, not after what we've just done." And he says, "Like, I wouldn't pull it before."
There's a vast literature on the misogyny of Ian Fleming and Bond that's out there, and I would refer you to the work of Lisa Funnell, who's also got a chapter in the book. What we make of that and how we assess that misogyny, I think, has changed, because there is a vast audience of all genders and all sexual orientations that, you know, love the Bond films and books. The humour, without doubt, is really only in the films and is absent in the books, as I'm sure you're aware. And again, it's largely down to Broccoli, who thought that humour, which comes in and out, it's less there with Sean Connery, although he has the throwaway lines, was there also in order to encourage audiences, and audience reaction. Right? So again, there's a commercial rationale for both the sex and the humour. It's not arbitrary, right? It's to get bums on seats, because that's what the film business is about. Getting money from bums on seats.
Well,
Sorry, if I put
perhaps
that
we
crudely.
should do the reverse and lift them from the seats, if we may. And I invite you all to take some refreshments which are just outside. But first of all, before we do that, thank you very much again for your time and for this very, very lively and thought-provoking event.